Today we're going to kick off the Unit Spotlight series. We're going to focus today and the next few videos on the Carpathian Independent Brigade. Now, this particular series, I'm going to break it into several different parts because I want to make it digestible for you guys. Small bits, covering their history, and then we'll do a video covering how to model them. Now, I'm going to wait on that particular video, though, until the British book drops. I want to see what they're going to do rule-wise, because some of the things I suggested in the compendium for second edition rules made sense, but I want to see what are they going to change for third to see if things would change here. And then finally, the last video we'll do in this particular series for the Carpathian is to cover kind of the tactics you'd use, how you would play them in the game. So with that, let's kind of get started with the history of the Carpathian Independent Brigade. Before we get into it too far, I want to kind of set the record straight on a few things. There's things that aren't really widely known about the strategic plan during the first few weeks of the invasion of Poland. You see, because the Poles actually had a plan in place with France and Britain on how they were going to handle an invasion from Germany. And in fact, they had a plan B. So plan A was relatively simple, and we actually saw plan A play out, just not quite the way the Poles intended. The plan all along was to kind of do a fighting withdrawal. They would be able to push back as much as they could. In fact, just as happened, some of the units actually made it into Germany, attacking into Germany before they were called back. But again, the plan, fight, a withdrawing force campaign, basically drawing the Germans further into Poland in a controlled manner. That's where the plan kind of fell apart. The reason for this is that was going to buy time, number one, for Britain and France to mobilize and launch their offensives into Western Germany, with Germany's main force being displaced into Poland. They would be that much further away from the British and French and much less able to respond quickly. So the Germans and French were theoretically supposed to be able to overwhelm what was defending Western Germany and put the Germans in a position where they would finally stop invading Poland. As we all know, that didn't work because Britain and France did not follow through with their promises. The French came in a couple of kilometers and went back. They didn't really do anything. That's why it's called the Sitzkrieg, or phony war. But you see, that was part of the plan, was for them to come in with, to do a fighting withdrawal so the British and French could come in. So the Poles are retreating, and unfortunately for the Poles, two things went wrong. One, the German tactics included envelopment, which is nothing new to many of the armies at the time. There were generals in all of the major armies that understood this concept and were trying to put it in practice. Just the Germans were the first to be able to do it because they had the opportunity and they had the right leaders in place. And that caused the envelopment of larger portions of the Polish army. So the German units were actually making more progress into Poland than the Poles expected. They were still, in some places, doing some good fighting withdrawals and really keeping the Germans back, especially in the southern Poland, where they would keep the Germans back to somewhere between less than 10 kilometers a day of progress, which is very little compared to the rest of Poland. But then things turned worse on the 17th of September, when the Soviets started their attack. Now the Soviets coming in, that was always, they were an enemy of Poland. They were they had lost part of their territory at the end of World War I to form Poland, so they wanted that back. And that's what the Curzon line was all about. That's what the line that was agreed to between Germany and Russia was all about, was getting that territory back. But there's no way, they knew they could not win against two fronts. Fortunately, they had a plan B in place. Even prior to the war's beginning, Poland had worked with both Britain and France to draw up treaties that would, in the event of the Polish being invaded and losing, their troops would be ordered to evacuate Poland through neutral countries and make their way to France or Britain. There, they would be allowed to create independent Polish armies in those two nations, because the plan also included the flight of the Polish government into exile. So the Polish government would be still in effect working. They never surrendered. There was no armistice. The French signed an armistice at the end of the June of 1940. The Poles never did. Their individual armies had surrendered, and groups of troops had surrendered, but the government never signed a surrender document. So the government was in exile in London, and there was also some in France. They were going to fight Germany with their own Polish army, reconstituted in these other countries. Well, fortunately, what this enabled is the Polish to leverage their good relations with their allies, Romania and Hungary. Yes, the Poles were actually allied with those two countries. And when they fled into those, they were peaceably interred by those two countries. All their equipment was surrendered to those two countries. You should see that there's photos of Hungarian Polish soldiers arm in arm, kind of taking photos in front of their equipment. Just, for them, the war has taken a pause. Hungary's not in the war yet. Poland, they've lived to fight another day, so they're all relaxed. This was not a situation where the Poles were being taken captive. They were supposed to be interred according to international law, neutrality agreements. But what actually happened is these countries kind of turned a blind eye, or facilitated even, the escape of these, quote, interred soldiers to other points west and east, mostly through the Mediterranean up into Portugal and up to France. But some couldn't make it to France. They made it instead to the east, towards French Syria, because the plan was to reconstitute the army in France. Well, that was successful for quite a few thousand actually, made it to Syria. Now, most of these were actually from the southern part of Poland, fighting in the mountains. They were actually Carpathians, that's the Carpathian mountain range in southern Poland, northern Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. And it turns out that a good portion of the men who made it to Syria happened to be from that area, happened to be mountain troops. Not that the mountain troops really helped them out during the desert fighting, but that's just a kind of part of their history. Well, come 1940, they have established an entire brigade again in Syria, with French equipment, French artillery pieces, French horses, because they included a recon element, the Uhlans, Carpathian Uhlans. That's lancers in English. Not that they actually used lances, but that was their cavalry unit. It was used like any cavalry used to be. Matter of fact, the British still had cavalry units at the time, so did the French. And this Carpathian unit was mounted on French horses. They had French howitzers, French anti-tank guns, French rifles, French uniforms. But the unit was able to reform a Carpathian infantry brigade. Now, what's really neat is that they were established as an independent Polish unit fighting with the French in Syria. Not that there was fighting to happen in Syria, but the plan was to move the unit from Syria with French transports to France so they could join the rest of their Polish counterparts who had fled Poland and join the fighting there where they knew eventually the French and British were going to attack Germany, not thinking that Germany would attack them first. Now, you might think this is fortunate or maybe unfortunate, but depending on how you look at it, the French just didn't have the transport capacity to get this brigade to France. So, come May of 1940, all of a sudden, Germany invades France, and this unit is stuck in Syria, unable to participate. Now, the reason that might be fortunate is that they were not having to fight the Germans, taking casualties, or worse, as several other Polish units in France, having to flee, find their way, make their way to the ports to escape to Britain. Some of the French troops, some of the Polish troops in France melted into the woods, so to speak, and became part of the resistance group in France. Some kind of fled into Switzerland because that's the opportunity they had. Some made it into Spain. Some were able to actually flee through the ports into England. So they were spared this. That means the unit is still full strength, but it's now in French territory, and France surrendered. Well, the Vichy government made their agreement with Germany, and they sent out the orders to all the French territories, French North Africa, French Syria, the possessions out in the Pacific, to hold or inter all foreign nationals, essentially, in the combatants. So all of a sudden, you've got the Vichy French government in Syria now wanting to inter the Poles again. Well, fortunately for the French and Poles, not everyone was going to play ball. There were a good portion of French officers and soldiers in Syria that were not going to have anything to do with the Vichy government. And so they made it possible, as they fled south to Palestine to join up with the British as the Free French, they made it possible for the Polish unit brigade to escape with their equipment into Palestine. So here we have an entire brigade leaving Syria and arriving in British Palestine in order to fight the Germans again, equipped fully with French gear. So here it is, middle of 1940, and the unit is now in a British territory, still fully constituted and ready for combat. All right, so we've got the brigade headed south to Palestine. It is a good place to stop and pick up in the next video with the career of the brigade while they were in Palestine and eventually in Egypt. So I hope that was kind of informative, and you're looking forward to the next episodes. Do me a favor, share, like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.